This story is not so much of a story as it is a lot of law. But this law is like a story. It's really important. Like everything else in the Bible, it's about people. In the book of Leviticus, there are many laws. There are guidelines beyond just those 10 commandments because there's so many things to think about. In this book, there are directions about how to offer sacrifices, about the duties of the priests and the Levites for which the book gets this name. It dictates a calendar and it sets forth a whole economic system. It talks about how people are to behave and how they are to live in relationship with one another. Because you have to remember that they were creating a whole new society. A whole new nation is being born. And this nation is not defined by its borders. It's not even defined by the land that they're living on. But this nation is defined by the people and their behavior and their God. And so the law that we find in Leviticus isn't so much about rules as it is about being holy, as it is about being different and set apart, just as God is holy, just as God is different than any other God that people have imagined, just as God is set apart from creation. So this book of Leviticus, these laws, these directions, are really for people to maintain their identity. There are things about honoring God, but it's not so much about that as never forgetting who they are and whose they are. You know, it took them 40 years wandering in the desert to figure themselves out, to figure out how to live with one another, how to live with God, how to live with themselves. And so all of these rituals, all of these directions, from the way that they dress to the things that they eat, are meant so that they don't lose their identity, so that they remember who they are and what's important. And we can relate to this. We know what it's like living in a global world. And you have so many competing voices to sometimes forget what's important to us. And for them, this holiness was not just about them and God, but how they relate to one another and even how they relate to the whole of creation. Now, this book of Leviticus was filled with a lot of rules and laws and directions. But you have to remember that this was for a purpose. And so Leviticus is followed by the book of Deuteronomy. That word Deuteronomy in Hebrew simply means the second law. But it wasn't just another book full of rules. It was actually the farewell discourse of Moses just before they enter into the promised land. If you will, this was Moses' last great lecture, the last opportunity he had to impart his faith and wisdom and everything that he had learned to the people that he had worked so hard to lead. And in this book, Moses begins by recounting all the things that God has done for the people. And Moses goes on to talk about all the blessings that come from following God, as well as the dangers of what happens when we don't follow God. Just like we've heard in the stories before and the stories that are going to come after this. And Moses, he goes into a lot of detail about these blessings and these dangers, but in the end, he wraps it up by talking about the importance of God's promise, of God's covenant to the people that God loves. And so this book of Deuteronomy is the end of Moses' story. It actually marks the end of his life. It's the end of the wandering in the desert, the end of the Exodus, the end of running from something. And it's just about to lead them to a new beginning. Because our very next story that we're going to share is about them entering the promised land and running to new life.